living our values under pressure out loud is a way to build trust in this moment in time.
An armed group um, took me as a hostage for several days.
And I do believe we actually do need progressive civil society in the North and South, not only in the global South. We need allies. We need all hands on deck. This is a moment of all hands on deck.
You know, the ideology and being idealistic has kind of been attributed to naivety and immaturity almost, right? Because they're too idealistic. They can't possibly succeed, or that's got to get rubbed out of them before they can actually get there. And that
But I think to your question, Sophia, the headline is, we've been talking a lot about sector changes, leadership, how individuals are reacting, responding, and what that means for the broader change. And I think getting an executive level perspective, not that you are the only executive level, but getting an executive level perspective, and that's why your journey is important. Like, how has that informed what is happening right now and how you're viewing it? I think would be the headline. Is that right, guys?
Yeah. Okay. But maybe let's start with your story, because like for me, when we spoke the first time, I was super inspired, and it left me in a mood of thinking and reflecting. I like your journey in the sector, and I felt it speaks to many of us. So it would be good to tell us and maybe the people who will listen later to this about your journey.
Well, thank you, Ali, and so great to join this dialogues. I've been listening to your 3 episodes several times, because every time I listen to one of your 3 episodes so far, I get new insights. So these are phenomenal, fantastic, and spontaneous conversations, and we need more of that rather than that panel talking point style, which somehow doesn't nourish our, let me say, souls, but it doesn't. So thrilled to be here. So I'm from Uruguay. That's my home country. I live in Ecuador. I am 57 years old. I grew up in my childhood in the 70s as a refugee during Uruguay's military regime and many of those regimes at the time in the southern cone of South America. So I guess, though I'm from Uruguay, I grew up already in several countries as my parents had to leave the country. And then I studied sociology in Uruguay and joined this line of work in '94 in Cambodia. But why Cambodia? How does an Uruguayan make it to Cambodia? I actually was more on a journey of wanting to do good in the world and thought that a good vehicle for that may be volunteering for an NGO. And I was rather kind of backpacking, if you see what I mean. I didn't arrive in Cambodia as an expatriate. I wanted to join an NGO inspired by, all the great leaders we have had in the world that want to do good. I was reading Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all of the above, and I felt this passion for social change. So I knocked doors. And I knocked the door of Save the Children and Oxfam and CARE. And I was doing my rounds in Cambodia, and I knocked the door of CARE. And they said, yeah, why not? You're here. So it was in '94. It was actually not very common to have someone from Latin America working in Cambodia in a country office of an international NGO, let alone as a volunteer or as a very junior staff. I was 25 at the time, so I'm revealing my age here. I already have. Why am I saying that? But anyway, I joined, and it was from day one very odd to me, the world that I encountered, because at that time, '94 in Cambodia, there were many NGOs in Cambodia after everything that happened there in the '70s, in the '80s, and CARE had probably 10, 15 expatriate staff. Immediately, the difference between the expatriate staff and the Cambodian staff and their conditions was, to me, impossible to understand and register from that very moment of time. And I didn't belong to any one of those 2 worlds, right? Because I wasn't I wasn't local staff. I wasn't expatriate staff. I was a foreigner. I didn't speak Cambodian at the time, so I didn't really belong. So from that vantage point, and that's what I told Ali when we had our first conversation, I had insights which I actually didn't think were very unique at the time or different. I thought everybody must be seeing it, but only when I joined the sector more formally and got a job, a proper job, and actually made it. I was my last job with CARE. I never thought that would be the case when I joined CARE at the time. I was Secretary General of CARE. That was my last job with CARE after 30 years, 3 decades with CARE. And I won't bore you with my trajectory of those 30 years. It was several jobs in many countries and many parts of the world, always based in the global south, never in the global north. So I also did my Secretary General role from Ecuador. But what I did is I started this notebook when I was 25 in 94, which I called My Colonial Page. Imagine that, before we ever spoke about decoloniality. I haven't kept them all, but I do have hundreds of pages of annotations of what I observed, for example, in team meetings in Cambodia, where and I didn't speak English very well at the time. It's better now, but at that time it was fairly broken. So I was struggling myself to adapt and understand and be part of and express ideas. And it wasn't easy. But at that time, I noticed very quickly that, for example, if I was able to package an idea eloquently in an elevator speechy way, better if it was in 1, 2, 3 in proper English, then I would be listened to. And then Cambodian colleagues that, like me, were attempting to put forward an idea in less eloquent ways, maybe even packaged in a different way, which may not have fit that norm, were not even listened to. Well, forget about if, for example, translation was involved. Then everyone who expected ideas only to be clearly expressed in English would not even attempt to listen carefully. So I found there a world. Well, what I did was start making annotations of how, for example, that really happened. And I couldn't believe it, that a Cambodian colleague would present an idea in broken English or via translation. And I thought, oh, wow, that's a good idea. But the colleague that spoke English very well would just take that idea and run with it and then present exactly the same idea and get all the credit for it. There was a lot of even taking knowledge. And what I did was like make those specific observations of what happened every day of our lives. So this is not about a big abstract analysis of decoloniality. This is how it manifests itself in daily life. And then we can find probably so many examples of it. But what I never thought at that time would happen was that, that we would, I don't know, 30 years later or 25 years later, only start talking about decolonizing aid. I thought it was a more urgent agenda, and I couldn't understand. And since then, I have been walking this strange tightrope, which is, in order to be accepted by the sector, I needed to learn to speak in that elevator speechy way of 1, 2s, and 3s, right? So I had to, because I was otherwise never been listened to. So I would have been expelled. I would never have gotten the next job. I would have not been able to make it. So I had to kind of adapt, but at the same time, I wanted to be able to be part of it, to transform it then from inside. And it's walking that tightrope, like, okay, let me be part of this, but then make space for something different and new, and I want to shape it from inside. And how do you do it and have I forgotten enough about my original intent? Have I been too quickly absorbed by kind of the logic and kind of checking in every day of my life, whether I was not being kind of shaped by the system or whether I could still attempt to change the system, if that makes sense. So that has been that tightrope, which, by the way, many women walk on, same thing, like in order to be accepted by the sector, you may even have to wear a blazer, you see in a meeting, in a World Bank meeting or UN meeting that resembles more a male suit, and but then when you're in there, you want to provide a more feminist perspective and influence it. But if you don't wear that suit, you may never be invited to the meeting. And I'm just saying suit just to illustrate, but I mean much more than that, right? And it's so hard to continue to walking that tightrope every day of your life. And I must say, after 30 years, and given the sliding back that we are seeing in the world, I just got very tired.
Yeah. I have one question that comes to my mind. Many CEOs and secretary generals, once they reach that level and experience and title and influence, they mainly position themselves or move to the global north, maybe because it gives them some kind of access and they are close to the power or something like that. But why you didn't do that? Why you didn't move to the global north?
Well, I just felt much more comfortable in my own surroundings in Latin America. And I felt that I could also more easily connect to the work in the global south that CARE was implementing. And whenever I wanted to visit a program and connect with it deeply, when I needed when I felt that I was taken to maybe one end of that tightrope, I needed to be able to quickly re-energize myself and be drawn back to what truly matters. However, it also had a huge disadvantage because all the influencing, the advocacy happened in DC, in London, in Geneva, and I had to get on a plane and I missed many critical meetings and fora in which it felt all was baked and decided, and then I couldn't add my voice easily. And that was hard. That was really, really hard. That made it very complex. But Ali, what I think, and I think we all connected via the Pledge for Change on Decolonizing Aid, and I was a founder of it together with other CEOs and secretary generals of some of the larger NGOs, and that felt like true excitement that we could come up with a promise. A pledge is a promise of transforming these INGOs deeply, and that meant that we could hopefully be more impactful and more aligned with the values that I honestly always believed in, and I didn't always see them sector manifesting.
Yeah.
Sofia, thank you. What some inspiration there. I'm blown away by the way you've narrated that. I particularly love the sort of relationship, the way you depicted eloquence equaled power and eloquence equaled then privilege and career progression. It's such a simple way of framing something that I think everyone in the aid world would resonate with and be able to understand very clearly. And I love the tension you talked about between that becoming absorbed in a system versus trying to remain resistant to it, and it sounded like a very constant dilemma, challenge, concern around becoming complicit or not, right? And navigating an incredibly fine line there. But I particularly enjoyed reference you said to sort of the early stages of when you joined, and you described being relatively idealistic in your ambitions, trying to change the world and have those motivations for joining. And I was thinking recently, earlier this week, in fact, ideology and being idealistic has kind of been attributed to naivety and immaturity almost, right? Because they're too idealistic. They can't possibly succeed, or that's got to get rubbed out of them before they can actually get there. And that pressure of pragmatism and operational discipline almost kind of erodes that. And so I just wondered, with the promise of the pledge that you were able to be an incredibly influential instigator of, that's an example of maintaining an ideological, ideal-based decision-making at that most senior level. It's a demonstration in my mind of being creative, right? Of being curious in the space that you've got. Back in, when was the pledge? 5-6 years ago, maybe a bit longer. When that started, the sector was not facing anywhere near the degree of pressure that we're currently experiencing. And so there was a bit more freedom and a bit more what bandwidth to think in those more creative ways. The pressures that we're facing now seem to be squeezing that creativity. So I wondered if you would, and this might be a bit unfair of a question in terms of putting you on the spot, and I certainly am not asking you to speak on behalf of other people, but for executive level senior leaders, the CEOs and the Secretary Generals in those positions today, how are they able to maintain that creativity? How are they able to stay thinking a bit more proactively and with an idealistic lens rather than the sort of pragmatism and stopping at that point?
That's such a good point. You're right, when we came up with the pledge, I mean, it was a deep moment of reckoning with racism in the sector, with white supremacy in the sector. We all know what happened in 2020, George Floyd, and how that was an immense wave all across the world in many parts of lives and sectors of life. So, but you're right, now we didn't even imagine the pressures we would be under now. And what I find most complex at this moment of time, and actually, Thomas, you mentioned in an amazing article that that you just wrote, and I would love us to discuss that too, because it is very, very powerful. Because it's all about, I think the idea of your article is about slowing down, the encounter with knowledge that feels important. Yet, with the sector now driven even by more urgency than before, because you're right, since I joined the sector, that is true, funding cycles, crisis, leaders often and mostly rewarded for kind of speed and decisiveness, right? Rather than for holding space and for disruptive ideas, and to reshape thinking. But I think right now, the real transformation is even more urgent, right? A real transformation is even more essential. And I'm an advocate for, let me use these set of words like for urgent patience, if that makes sense to you, for urgent patience, because unless we have that, I just feel that everything might kind of implode, because otherwise, unless we keep, and you're very right to point out that idealistic ideology is often seen as something which is like in the way of making progress. But I find that unless, and this is a tightrope too, we keep both a strategic compass and a moral compass. If we need both in order to make a difference in the world, and somehow the urgency of the moment, kind of puts pressure on us to be only driven by this strategic compass, how to survive, how to get more funding, how do we keep offices open, rather than the moral compass on which all of what we do is actually based. Both is important, but we might forget it along the way. And you're right, it gets some sort of bad press, often that moral compass, the ideals, we the people that Ali refers to frequently, which I find so inspiring. Let me put in a feminist slogan in here into the mix, like nothing about us without us. That's the essence of it all. And if we don't, with urgent patience, listen to precisely that, what Global South movements, what Global South mutual aid networks are saying, then the whole construct simply serves no purpose. And I do believe we actually do need progressive civil society in the North and South, not only in the global South. We need allies. We need all hands on deck. This is the moment of all hands on deck. You know, the world as we know it is literally falling apart. Wars, genocides, oppression, and we can't afford to not be in solidarity with each other, but that requires connecting deeply and respecting each other and bringing the mainstream of values rather than the survival mode and urgency urgently and patiently into our dialogues.
But another way of saying what you were mentioning, Thomas, is pragmatic optimism. Because like it's easy to kind of naysay idealism, and it's easy to say, yeah, the common theme or the common, way of working is practicality, pragmatism. But there's real power in pragmatic optimism. And for me, that's where that tightrope is. I find the space of trade-offs so interesting because that's the crux of where you live your values under pressure. And if now is the time to live your values under pressure, that's the crux of that tightrope where I have to make a trade-off between practicality and between my, and my values or the moral argument. What do I do? So often, when the two are aligned, it's easy to live your values. But when all of a sudden it's, do I do equitable compensation for my staff, or do we get the margin we need to survive? What is your trade-off? And there's often not an easy answer. So I'm not saying that it's easy at all. But the first step is to, like, as you say, Sophia, pause, notice that it's a trade-off, that it's a decision to be made, and you have a choice. And then have the discussion with the right set of people around the table. So not the easy set of people around the table to say, how are we going to do this transparently? That's where I think it's really interesting. And there's space and opportunity for growth to say, how are we living our values under pressure? I think things like the pledge give frameworks and frankly cover for some organizations to say, well, so-and-so is doing it this way. Here's an example. So maybe we should be doing it, because it does breed creativity when we can see others doing it. If we don't do it now, then we erode the trust. We already know trust is an issue. Narratives are an issue. Living our values under pressure out loud is a way to build trust in this moment in time.
Yeah. And I think there are two things that come to my mind. The first one is the real test of values is under pressure. Like, it's so easy to say we commit to X, Y, Z when things are okay. But when we are under pressure, that's the real test. The second one that comes to my mind, oh my God, I could hear my heart is beating. I want to share a personal story. When I was in a country operation, what happened is that an armed group took me as a hostage for several days, and the organization that employed me, they left me behind. So that group took my passport, everything I had, my laptop, my external hard drives, even my clothes, everything, and left me in one apartment. I couldn't communicate with anyone. I couldn't speak to anyone. I was under extreme level of pressure in a country that technically it's not my country. I couldn't even share what's happening with me. And there was a colleague with me also going through the same situation. And that colleague also was under so much pressure. And, the days will come and go, and we are extremely isolated in that apartment. And you are just sitting with your thoughts. You are in the middle of a crisis. You are not sure what tomorrow will look like. And you are waiting for them to come to the apartment to take you somewhere or see what will happen. And when I don't tell this story that much, but when I tell it, people always ask me, and how did you manage to deal with that? What did you do? And all these things. So technically what I did, I had to pause, and I became three versions of myself. The first version is the past me, the old version of me, who also went through so many crises and struggles and all that. The second version is the present me, who's dealing with the thing that's happening. And the third version is the future me, who is living in the future, went through this current crisis, and looking at, okay, what could possibly go well, what could go wrong, like imagining all the different scenarios. And remember, I am in that apartment isolated, and my other colleague is also in the stress panic mood. So technically, I had to speak to myself in those three versions. And because of that technique that I did, and later life tested me again and again in similar situations where I had to speak to those three versions became like the counsel, assessing, thinking, looking at the situation from different angles, and agreeing that no matter what we do, those three versions, those are the values and the things, the principles that we are going to stick to, and we are going to deal with X, Y, Z in different cases. Now, the main reason why I'm saying this story, because of course, it's so easy when we talk to leaders and tell them, oh, you should reflect, you should think, you should pause. They will look at this from like a naive perspective or something. And when we talk about an organization, they will also look at it from organizational side. But here I'm talking about one individual who went through extreme level of stress in a crisis. Tomorrow is not clear. And the way to deal with that was actually pausing, reflecting, and thinking. Yeah, and the same technique helped me so much in my life after. So I really think, like, for me personally, it has so much value as an individual.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Ali. And it's a fascinating way of recognizing the mental state, the psychological state that you're going through, and developing coping strategies that are consciously pulling you back into the calm, more regulated state, recognizing that's the space that you need to be in to be able to think a bit more positively moving forward. Really powerful. Thank you.
Okay. But what I find so interesting is that we in the sector, we went through so many different crises and emergencies and different shape of shocks. But COVID is one, but funding cut is the classic every year shock, and the access and operational challenges and so many other things. So I do find it a bit interesting why the pausing, reflecting, and thinking of, and what you also mentioned in your article, Thomas, why we didn't really master that skill at executive level.
I don't think we needed it. I mean, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Sophia, but I mean, the guys know I've been thinking about this quite a lot. And as the old system that you so eloquently described, that you had documented, which I find so interesting, your whole career trajectory that you documented, as that is kind of falling away, there are those that are transitioning from that old system to a new future. And there are those that have always been building the new futures, that for the last 20, 30 years have been building new ways of doing things. But how do we take what is worth bringing over and keeping it? And how do we live our values in this process? I think the leaders that made it in the dominant system, as you said, had to be really good at code switching, had to be good at the eloquent talk, had to be good at not asking for help, at making quick decisions, at doing that kind of hero leadership. In the new way, what are the capabilities that we need? I think it's going to be the ability to do self-regulation and co-regulation. I think it's going to be the ability to bring your whole self and be vulnerable and tell stories and try and live those values under pressure, because there's going to be more pressure. When this crisis is over, there's just going to be a new one. So we're going to have to get good at doing this. And when we mess up and fail, repairing and building trust. What my first question in your story, Ali, was what kind of trust was lost in others' reactions, not just what your reaction was and how you managed yourself, but how the system failed you. Is just the loss of trust there is incredible. I don't know, Sophia, that, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You're the one that has had to make these decisions in real time.
Well, well, thank you, Kim, for those reflections. And I am, of course, very moved and thinking about Ali's story and trust. The word trust also was top of my mind. You know, what happens when you're left alone in that way? And your ability, Ali, to then so clearly kind of segment your former you, your present, and the future you want to be is just an incredible insight to what we all should be doing more of amidst of a crisis. And it's nothing compared to what you went through. I mean, this is the easy stuff, what we're talking about, right? Compared to that actual personal experience of being kidnapped. So it feels like if you were able to do that at that time, we all should be doing so much better. I mean, you're leading by example, Ali, and I have such deep admiration for you. How do we do this at this time? I mean, I'm now, of course, in a very different position than I was. I left care just over a year ago, but I'm trying to think back, and it is always about giving space to leaders like Ali, you know, recognizing also within a large organization where the Kims, the Thomases, the Alis of the world are, and attempting to bring in more of those voices, making space. That tightrope is about this. It is absolutely impossible, precisely pretending that, you know, the leader must be the leader that decides on quickly and fast in front of every camera on their own. That's what leads to failure. It is all about expanding attempting to transform an organization or a team into a movement, an activist movement that sticks together, that trusts each other, that works in a way that we can all be who we are in the room, rather, you know, speaking eloquently in 1, 2s, and 3s. And I think that's the only way forward. If you attempt to, not always successfully, to shape your most immediate environment in that way and create that energy and that listening and that urgent patience and that and celebrate the idealism and celebrate the values, but that's an everyday job, and it's not about oneself, it's about the collective that we try to build. And that's true in any one role I have had. I've tried to do that, again, not always successfully. But again, the sector values, you know, the kind of thought leader that has lots of intelligent things to say and is so fantastic on a panel that everyone will be blown away by. And if what you want to do is actually gather as many incredible people in a team and share, let me say, the power across horizontally and collectively, and as a result feel stronger, not necessarily will you always be rewarded for it, you know, because also that takes time, and the system wants to be fast and wants from you answers rather than, you know, the asking questions all the time and the co-creation. Rather, you have to have responses. You have to have, like, on a panel, if you say, or if I would say to you right now, Kim, I really don't know, you know, how would I be judged now, even on this podcast, by those?
I personally trust people that say, I don't know, and I'm trying to figure it out, and this is how, much more than someone who has an answer. Because how can anyone have an answer in today's world? It's moving too fast. By the time you have an answer, something's changed.
Exactly, and that's precisely it, and that's why I'm super excited now, because in addition to still co-chairing the Pledge for Change with Amitabh from Oxfam International, I'm doing so in my independent capacity. I'm now the coordinator of the Latin American Forum on Decolonizing Aid, which brings together 350 organizations and movements, and that are truly grassroots movements. It includes like the Abya Yala indigenous movement of Latin America. It includes the Clock Via Campesina, the peasant way. It includes a completely different set of actors in which this type of being and connecting is actually everyday life without attempting to have the all answers nicely packaged with imperfection, if that makes sense. So it's so liberating to now be. I have been incredibly energized by two major events we have had in the last year, which rather than being workshops, they felt more like festivals, where also music and dancing and connecting in different ways played a role. And I'm thinking of all the flip charts I was in front of, not diminishing it, but with a pen, which also felt good, but where another kind of idealism of energy never made it to the room. And what we needed then at the end of the days, was a nicely packaged report that probably then few people may have read or even followed up on. So how do we bring the sense of deep solidarity, of true alliances and partnership and vibrancy, and yes, that type of leadership and vision and idealism? By the way, most of these leaders have worked for most of their lives without any remuneration, right? This is who they are. This is what they want to do. This is not a job. This is a cause. And I do think that many of us in the, let me say, traditional aid sector may have joined with the spirit of cause, but then something else happens along the way. And unless you are super careful, that tightrope, you can fall on the other side. So the sense of a cause is, I think, what we need to now bring more to the forefront at this very critical time. And by the way, you're right, Ali, also when you said the sector is so used to complex situation, let alone the story you just told us, and trying to find a way out amid some of the most critical moments that one can possibly encounter in life. And so many thousands of colleagues, especially those working in the Global South, have had to deal with that. Now, I think it's also a moment where, and we're seeing in the Global North, authoritarianism, right-wing extremism, frankly, fascism advancing, where all the skills that we have learned in the Global South about how to navigate complexity and oppressive authoritarian regimes, now you would think that the experts that do that every day of their lives in their own context could actually be really, really good advisors for our Global North colleagues that are now finding similar situations in their own surroundings. So the solidarity must now also be from the South to the North to share those lessons, to share those insights, rather than let's all freak out. Yeah.
I got so inspired by your depiction of festival type atmosphere at conferences, and just the way you talked about the collection of entities and people and bodies that are there. And one thing I constantly find myself kind of pushing against is this notion of the other, right? And the fact that as the system we're talking about here is crumbling, the rhetoric, and I don't think people intentionally mean this, but the rhetoric we tend to use is, what's the alternative, right? And we talk about a single alternative to what we've currently lost, whereas the future isn't a single thing, right? The future is going to be the culmination of small, and what you just described is a phenomenally exciting articulation, demonstration, celebration of spaces that don't need a globally aggregatable framework to which they have to conform, right? They are just where they're convening spaces where individuals that want to exercise that value of humanity as a personal identity, not an institutional marketing slogan, where they want to live that, they find a space to do that. And there's so much requirement for that in the world today. The idea that there'll be another alternative, one single structure, it's this fallacy, right?
Yeah. I want to share just a quick example and hear your reflections on it. And I mentioned it briefly. So recently I came across two organizations, or one organization and a group of volunteers. The first organization is international. Their main office is in the global north. They are working for a country operation in the global south. The second group is diaspora group. And the second group, they were collecting money, mainly to support with food items for the same country location that is going through crisis. I don't want to name the exact country, also to not cause any issues for the international and the diaspora group. So I will call that country Zelda. So the interesting thing is that this diaspora group, they collected around $10,000. The international organization managed to get a grant with almost 600,000. So I was looking at what this diaspora group managed to achieve. First, the communication and their system was mainly a WhatsApp group. So they were just looking how they will send the money to the country and how a group of volunteers in that country will go, will buy food items, and will come with a list for the people in need in certain villages, and then buy the items and then distribute. The international organization spent around more than 70% of the money that they got on program support, country operational cost, regional level, headquarter level, overhead, and all that. And less than 30% went to the same location. And of course, that diaspora group, they did the distribution within less than 2 days. The international organization, until now, they didn't complete it. Now it's been around 3-4 weeks. The interesting thing that I see, which is an example we are all familiar with, but look at those two systems. The Astra group collecting that money, it's a small amount, but this massive impact on the ground, and it went fully 100% to the country. Even in the country, a group of volunteers distributed that. The international one, they are still waiting, going through all that processes and all that. And of course, I understand the compliance part, but I find it interesting that 70% of that 600,000 went to support that 30%. And day after day, I feel like, but I'm actually convinced and confident that the future will be those different unique systems. Maybe that system of the international one will not disappear, but there are small ones, they are growing and growing because they are proving efficiency. That's what I'm seeing. So I'm curious about hearing your thoughts on such examples.
I think that sounds amazing, Ali. And those are the examples that we need to be inspired by. And in fact, I'm sure that you have discussed this, and I know you have in previous podcasts, but the whole term like localization, because localization suggests that, in the global south, whatever the more like the global north system did needs to localize, but it should be then therefore exactly the same, like localizing what already, I really don't like that word for that reason. And therefore I prefer to use the word like locally led rather than localizing what may already have been there that now the international community is not able to do anymore. And if we find truly locally led options like the one you're describing, that we can then be in solidarity with, and with caution, because the minute, with caution, because the minute you bring money in, it can also be negatively disrupted. So the whole do no harm notion must be part of the picture and how you do it so that it's not altered in its authentic motivation that is idealistic and full of that energy, but at the same time supporting it to grow, not also keeping it just there as kind of the small local option because something else and bigger must happen. No, how do we do it so that this is what actually goes viral? The example that you just explained goes viral and inspires, and everything else falls like a domino effect rather than, kind of keeping control over. And this is where I think we need creativity and options and ideas. And they're simply not there if we are just attempting to keep a system as it exists alive. And unfortunately, a lot of the energy is going to that rather than to, these kind of phenomenal examples going viral. And if we could only think of ways, and for that we need these dialogues and this energy and this creativity. And what is really dangerous right now is that this could be a moment where we forget about being creative. Yet there was not ever in my lifetime a moment where that was not more important.
Agreed. I do wonder whether I like to think this might just be me being too optimistic, glass half full and things, but I'd like to believe that creativity is happening. We're just not looking in the right places for it, and we're constantly looking to a traditional set of structures to be the origins of that creativity, and they're just not, and we're feeling disappointed by that. And yet that creativity is taking place elsewhere, and I love the sort of desire for that to become viral, because there's something so organic and communicative, not in the right way. There's something so together about a viral piece, right? Rather than an imposition of something clinical and strategic and well thought through and wordsmith and all the rest of it. I think that virality is where the future of humanity, the future of that creativity, the future of what is going to come next is going to happen. It's not in a templated one size fits all thing. And whatever iteration of the old multilateral aid architectures emerge from this period of transition, there'll be a space for that, but they'll have to shape, and it will be a space that they are invited into, not a space where they are assuming dominance. And that's a pivotal shift in mindset and approach that's going to have to take place.
Can I just offer, and I'm looking at you, Thomas, as our informal timekeeper. I know what you're thinking. One common through line that I'm hearing through this entire conversation is authenticity. And Sofia, it started with your story of your journey, which is saying, for your whole career, you had to walk this line of how to, make it in the professional world while still staying true to your authenticity. And I heard it in the festival atmosphere of the forums where people are being authentic to themselves and bringing their whole selves. And we're hearing it in the different small models that are coming off that are authentic to and locally led. I think we get stuck when we try and extrapolate, scale out, and make truths of things that are authentic. So that is another tension and a fine line of how do you learn and connect the dots while staying authentic. But if we can find leaders, individuals, and systems that are committed to being authentically themselves, then that feels like we're moving in the right direction. It feels like we're getting closer to the truth. And I'm not saying that that's going to be easy, but isn't that a better way of doing it than replicating what's been happening in the past?
I completely agree. And Sofia, you mentioned the article that I wrote, and I talk about assimilated versus accommodating different types of knowledge. And Kim, what you're saying there is we've got to accommodate these differences. And by doing that, we are accepting that this new information, this new knowledge changes our existing frameworks of understanding, right? Assimilating something is where you make it fit what you already know. And that's not what we want to do. Right, but I do wonder there's a spectrum of that accommodation maybe, and I also talk about the disorientating dilemma, right? If you get to that space, it can invite creativity, but if it goes too far and you get to these moments of rupture where it becomes existential, I think it stifles the creativity and it just pulls you back into what you think is a safe space. You just repetition of pattern behavior, you do what's worked before, irrespective of whether you know or think that it is going to work now. You don't have an alternative and the risks are too high to say I don't know, and failure is just not an option, so you go to what you've done before. So we've got to get that sweet spot of accommodating this where we can accept these things, we're receptive to all that new information. But to do that, we've got to acknowledge our own emotional state, our own psychological condition, the environment that we're within, the circumstances that are taking place. That's a messy web of things that need a lot of very cognitive thought processes to understand.
And Thomas, what is dangerous though is that going back to what we know may get the label still of localization, decolonization. That's the big danger, that at least if it's going backwards, let's call it what it is. What I'm most scared of is, on top of it, it will be packaged in nice ways where we can't so easily then disentangle what is truly new and what is just the old packaged in with fancy labels. So, and I'm glad someone is the timekeeper here, because in fact, I want to apologize to everyone who is might be listening later. I probably have taken too much space, but I hope they will forgive me for the simple reason that I'm new to this crowd and I have been asked some questions. So forgive me for that, because I probably could stay forever and ever and ever and ever with the three of you. So forgive me for that.
Absolutely forgiven. Absolutely forgiven. And Kim has a lovely way of talking about this. This is the conversation that takes place before the panel conversation with scripted remarks.
Yeah.
Love it. Just absolutely love it.
I want to say a quick thing also, as we are speaking to the listeners. Last week, or within this week, with what's happening in Middle East and all the things that I was dealing with, like friends, colleagues, family, organizations that I'm supporting and all that. I had a couple of days I couldn't even leave my my room, just behind the laptop and from one thing to another. But I managed to go out for a cup of coffee and short walk under the sun. And that magical touch that the sun and that cup of coffee had on me, like I felt like I'm carrying all that on my shoulders. The moment I started walking around in nature with cup of coffee and the sun, suddenly I felt extremely relieved. So I really think those small, tiny things, maybe we don't realize their value, but they do so much. Especially later when I sat and I started reflecting and writing my own thoughts. I felt like I switched back, like I went back and then just restarted my thoughts and emotions. So I highly recommend people do those kind of things.
Well, why don't we end it there with a commitment that we're each going to go outside and take a little walk?
I love
that
it.
idea.
That was nice.
That would be wonderful. Hey, thank you for allowing me to join this conversation. I'm so inspired by the three of you. You're just incredible.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, you've given a lot of inspiration yourself in this call, so thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
The world is calling. Gotta go. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.